The mother looked almost ghostly, her eyes rimmed in red even through the fading sepia tones of the photograph. The oldest son, perhaps 17, stood stiff as a fence post. His arms glued to his sides, his jaw locked in a tension that seemed to hum beneath the stillness. The two middle daughters kept their gazes carefully away from the camera, as though afraid that looking straight into the lens might reveal too much. And the youngest child? She wasn't pretending at all. Her eyes were fixed downward, drawn helplessly to something the others dared not acknowledge. Laura began her investigation with the embossed photographer's mark. Garrett and Sons, a studio that had once thrived in Palmyra, New York from 1878 to 1903. She traced their advertisements in the old Palmyra Courier offers of family portraits taken at your residence and likenesses guaranteed to satisfy. A traveling studio serving rural families who could not easily make the journey into town. Next, she needed the family's identity. The farmhouse in the photograph was distinctive decorative gingerbread trim, a particular rhythm to the windows. If the building still existed, someone might recognize it. Laura posted the image on a historical preservation forum, inviting anyone familiar with the architecture or the region to reach out. While waiting, she turned to the newspapers of August 1885. If something had happened that summer, something the photograph was quietly whispering about, the papers would hold its echo. She scanned the front pages first, major stories, tragedies, scandals. And then on August 19th, 1885, page 3, she found it. A tiny article almost swallowed by the surrounding columns. Local youth missing family seeks information. It read, Michael Garrett, age 16, son of prominent farmer Joseph Garrett, has not been seen since the evening of August 15th. The young man left the family farm on Canandaigua Road, stating he was going to town, but never arrived. Anyone with information should contact the Wayne County Sheriff's Office. Laura's hands trembled. The photograph was stamped August 1885. A 16-year-old boy, a Garrett, vanished on August 15th. How soon after his disappearance had this portrait been taken? And what kind of family poses for a formal photograph days after a son goes missing, unless they already knew exactly where he was? For the next week, Laura buried herself in the Palmyra Courier archives, following the thin thread of Michael Garrett's disappearance. The coverage was brief and dwindled quickly. After the initial notice, there were only 2 more mentions. August 26th. Still no word on missing youth. September 10th. Sheriff concludes search for Garrett boy. That final article quoted Sheriff Thomas Bradford. After thorough investigation, we conclude young Michael Garrett likely left home of his own accord. No evidence of foul play. The case is closed unless new information arises. But Laura noticed what wasn't said. No accounts of search parties, no witness interviews, no detailed statements from the family. For the son of a wealthy, well-connected farmer to vanish. The silence was startling. Too thin, too quiet. As though the investigation had been performed with deliberate gentleness, avoiding the places where uncomfortable truths might be found. She turned to the property records for Canandaigua Road, 1885. The Garrett farm stretched across 240 acres of rich agricultural land. Joseph Garrett had purchased it in 1870 and built it into one of Wayne County's most prosperous holdings. The tax rolls showed considerable wealth. The property was valued at $15,000, a small fortune. Joseph served as director of the Palmyra Savings Bank and trustee of the local Presbyterian church. He was a powerful man, the kind of man whose troubles might be handled quietly, respectfully, away from prying eyes. Laura knew she needed the family's full lineage. If any Garrett descendants were still alive, someone might hold a memory, a whisper, something passed down behind closed doors. She charted the genealogy through the decades. Joseph and Mary Garrett had 6 children. Michael, born 1869, Robert, 1871, Elizabeth, 1873, Caroline, 1875, and the youngest, Sarah, born 1877, the little girl in the photograph whose frightened gaze seemed frozen forever on the porch floor. But Michael? There was no death certificate, no marriage record, no obituary. After August 15, 1885, he simply vanished from official existence. The other children left clearer traces. Robert inherited the farm and died in 1924. Elizabeth married and moved to Syracuse. Caroline died at 23 from tuberculosis, and Sarah, little Sarah, lived the longest. She survived until 1963, passing away at age 86 in a Rochester nursing home. Laura felt a slow, heavy thudding in her chest. Sarah had been 8 years old when the photograph was taken. 8 years old when Michael disappeared. Old enough to remember. Old enough to understand. Old enough to hold a secret that might have shadowed her life for 78 quiet years. Old enough to know what or who had been beneath the porch that day. The nursing home where Sarah had spent her final years no longer existed, its walls long, demolished, its halls faded into memory. But Laura, persistent as ever, followed the trail of paperwork. She contacted the company that had absorbed the home's old records, and after several phone calls and a formal research request, a scanned admission file appeared in her inbox. Most of it was routine medical notes, financial forms, administrative signatures. But one sheet stood out. A simple page marked emergency contact information and family history. And under special notes written in rounded blue ink, patient occasionally speaks of what happened to Michael, becomes agitated, recommend not pressing for details, appears to be a source of significant trauma. Laura felt a slow chill spread through her. Sarah had lived nearly 9 decades, and the memory of what happened to Michael had followed her all the way to the end. But the timeline, she still needed the timeline. The newspaper stated that Michael vanished on August 15th. The photograph was stamped only August 1885, but professional photographers usually kept meticulous appointment books. So Laura contacted the Palmyra Historical Society. The volunteer coordinator sounded delighted, promising to check their small archive of business materials. 2 days later, Laura found herself in a cramped research room, the air thick with the scent of old paper and dust, turning the delicate pages of a leather-bound appointment ledger from 1885. The handwriting was careful, each line a small window into another life. August 5, Harrison family. 4 subjects indoor portrait. August the 7th, Whitmore wedding bride and groom, outdoor. August 12th, Thompson family, 6 subjects parlor. Then Laura reached the entry. Her heart somehow knew would be there. August 17, Garrett family, Canandaigua Road outdoor porch setting. 2 days. Just 2 days after Michael Garrett was reported missing, the family had summoned a photographer. They had stood on that porch dressed in their best clothing, while Michael was where? Laura could see it as clearly as if she were standing there. The rigid poses, the haunted eyes the silence held between them, and the fingers reaching up from beneath the boards. She photographed the ledger page, forcing herself to breathe, then continued. Another entry, September 3rd. Returned to Garrett residence to deliver finished portraits and take additional photographs as requested. The photographer had gone back. 2 weeks later. Had the hand still been there then? Had anyone seen it when the portraits were dropped off, or had the family ensured it would never be seen again? Laura kept reading. September 10th. J. Garrett declined further portrait work. Seemed agitated. Did not invite me inside as before. Transaction conducted on porch. Paid in full. Suggested I not return. September 10th. The very day the sheriff closed the investigation. Margaret, the elderly volunteer, noticed Laura's stricken expression. Found something interesting? She asked gently. The Garrett family, Laura said. Do you know anything about them? Any local stories? Margaret hesitated. Her face changed, closed, cautious. That's old history, she murmured. And most of the old families around here, they've got skeletons they'd rather keep buried. What kind of skeletons? A long silence. Then Margaret slowly shut the door to the research room. My grandmother lived here her whole life, she began. She heard things, stories they never printed in the newspapers. The Garrett farm was one of those stories. Laura leaned forward, hardly breathing. There was a son who disappeared, Margaret said softly. Never found. They said he ran away to Buffalo or Rochester. But folks around here didn't believe it. They said they'd been shouting that night. Terrible sounds from the Garrett house. One neighbor said he heard a young man begging, pleading. And then, silence. Margaret's grandmother had been friends with the daughter of the neighboring family, the Pritchards, whose farm bordered the Garrett property to the east. Laura dove into more records tracing the Pritchards. Samuel Pritchard had owned 180 acres beside the Garrett farm. Their families would have shared equipment, labored together at harvest, attended the same church, exchanged favors across generations. In the Palmyra, Historical Society's vertical files, those unruly manila folders stuffed with decades of forgotten documents, Laura found something extraordinary. A collection of oral history interviews from the 1970s. One transcript in particular made her pulse thrum. An interview from 1976 with Harold Pritchard Samuel's grandson. He had been 89 years old at the time. The interviewer had asked about old farming families. Harold had mentioned the Garretts. Laura read slowly, each line settling in her mind like dust on an unused shelf. My father was 15 in 1885, old enough to remember it clear. He was in the barn late that night, tending a sick cow, when he heard shouting from the Garrett place. Their house was maybe 400 yards from ours, close enough to hear raised voices on a quiet summer night. My father said it sounded like an argument between Joseph Garrett and his oldest boy, Michael. He heard Michael say, "I won't keep quiet about it. What you're doing is wrong, and I'm going to tell them." Laura felt her breath catch. Then there was more shouting and something like a fight. Furniture breaking, glass shattering. My father thought about going, but he was scared. Joseph Garrett was a hard man, not someone you crossed lightly. After a while, everything went quiet. My father told his own father what he'd heard. The next day, they said Michael had disappeared. When the sheriff came, Harold's grandfather had explained what the boy heard. But Sheriff Bradford brushed it away. Just a family dispute. Boys ran away all the time. And with that, the matter was quietly, neatly closed. But the truth, Laura realized, had never left. It had only been buried like a whisper beneath a porch board, waiting for someone who knew how to listen. The investigation had reached a dead end, but one detail had always haunted her father. 3 days after Michael disappeared, the Garrett family hired a photographer to come to the farm. He remembered seeing the photographer's wagon roll past their property and thinking how strange it was. Who arranges a formal family portrait when their son has just gone missing? The decision unsettled him. After that summer, he said the Garretts changed. They withdrew from the community, stopped socializing, and never again spoke Michael's name, as if erasing him could erase what had happened. Laura set down the transcript, her hands trembling. The pieces were aligning into a horrifying picture she could barely bear to imagine. Michael must have discovered something his father was involved in, something serious enough to confront him over. They argued. And then Michael vanished. But what secret was so damning that Joseph Garrett would silence his own son to protect it? She returned to the financial records and combed through Garrett's dealings as a bank director. That was where she found it, in a Syracuse newspaper from November 1885, 3 months after Michael disappeared. The headline was unmistakable: Palmyra bank director accused of embezzlement scheme. The article detailed how Joseph Garrett had created false accounts using the names of dead depositors, slowly siphoning off nearly $23,000, an astronomical sum for its time. The most chilling part, however, was buried. Midway through the article, Michael had worked at the bank the previous summer. Investigators believed he might have uncovered the irregularities. He disappeared shortly afterward. The sheriff had dismissed the case at the time, but the implication now was unmistakable. Michael had become a threat. Laura read the article again and again, the horror deepening with every pass. She followed the trail through court records. Joseph Garrett was convicted, sentenced to 10 years in Auburn State Prison, and died there in 1889. Not once during the trial did anyone mention the circumstances of Michael's disappearance beyond calling him a runaway. No one questioned why the boy vanished mere days after allegedly discovering his father's fraud. And yet, one piece of evidence remained: the photograph. That terrible image of the Garrett family, posed stiffly on their porch while beneath their feet, through a narrow gap in the boards, a hand reached up from the darkness. A hand the family refused to acknowledge. A hand frozen in desperation. Laura needed to know whether Michael had still been alive when the shutter clicked. She traveled to Palmyra in early April, photograph in hand. The Historical Society held old business archives, including a few surviving records from Garrett & Sons photography. 2 days later, she sat in a cramped research room examining an appointment ledger from 1885. August 17th, Garrett family, Canandaigua Road outdoor porch portrait. 2 days after Michael disappeared, another entry appeared on September 3rd. The photographer delivered the finished portraits and took additional images. And on September 10th, the same day the sheriff closed the investigation, J. Garrett declined further work, appeared agitated, conducted transaction on porch, requested I not return. A volunteer at the society. Margaret watched Laura's expression and quietly closed the door. Her grandmother, she said, had once spoken of the Garrett farm, of screams, heard the night Michael vanished, of a neighbor who claimed he heard a boy pleading before everything went silent. Stories people whispered but never repeated publicly. Following this lead, Laura traced the Pritchard family who had owned the farm next to the Garretts. They were the neighbors who had heard the sounds that night. Something had happened on that farm. And whatever it was, the truth had been buried, perhaps literally, beneath the boards of the Garrett porch. The Garretts and the Pritchards had been close in the way neighboring farming families often were sharing labor, during harvest lending tools, attending the same church. In the Palmyra Historical Society's vertical files tucked among yellowing manila folders organized by family name, Laura discovered something invaluable, a series of oral history interviews recorded in the 1970s with elderly residents who still remembered 19th century Palmyra. One transcript, dated 1976, featured an interview with Harold Pritchard, then 89 years old, and the grandson of Samuel Pritchard, the man who had lived on the farm beside the Garretts. As Laura read Harold's recollections, dread curled in her stomach. Harold said his father had been 15 in 1885, old enough to remember everything clearly. He'd been in the barn late on the night of August 15th, tending to a sick cow, when he heard shouting from the Garrett house. Their homes were only about 400 yards apart, close enough for voices to carry on a quiet summer night. His father distinctly heard Michael arguing with Joseph, "I won't keep quiet about it. What you're doing is wrong, and I'm going to tell." Then came more shouting. A struggle. Furniture crashing, glass shattering. His father thought about checking on them, but fear held him back. Joseph Garrett had a reputation for being a hard, dangerous man. Eventually the noise stopped. Silence settled over the farm. The next day word spread that Michael Garrett had vanished. Harold's grandfather told the sheriff what his son had heard, but Sheriff Bradford brushed it aside as a simple family quarrel. Boys. Michael's age, he insisted, ran away all the time. The investigation ended before it began, but one detail had stayed with Harold's father for the rest of his life. 3 days after Michael disappeared, the Garretts hired a photographer. He remembered watching the photographer's wagon roll past and thinking how wrong it felt. Who poses for a formal portrait while their son is missing? After that summer, the Garrett family withdrew from the community, stopped socializing, and erased Michael's name from conversation as though burying the boy's memory would hide the truth of what happened. Laura set the transcript down, hands trembling. The pieces were aligning into a horrifying picture. Michael had uncovered something his father was involved in, something serious enough that he threatened to expose it. They argued, and then Michael was gone. But what secret was worth killing a son to protect? She dug into Joseph Garrett's financial records, combing through his activities as a director of the Palmyra Savings Bank. That was where she found it, a Syracuse Herald article from November 12, 1885. Palmyra Bank, director accused of embezzlement scheme. The details were elaborate and damning. For at least 2 years, Joseph had siphoned money by creating accounts under the names of dead depositors, slowly transferring funds into these ghost accounts, and then withdrawing the money for himself. Nearly $23,000 had vanished, an enormous fortune at the time. Then came the chilling line, buried deep in the article, Michael Garrett had worked at the bank the summer before he vanished. He may have discovered the fraud. 3 months later, he disappeared. Laura reread the article in growing horror. Then the court coverage. Joseph was convicted in December 1885, sentenced to 10 years in Auburn State Prison, where he died of pneumonia in 1889. Not once did anyone connect Michael's disappearance to Joseph's crimes. No one questioned the timing. No one asked why the boy had threatened his father days before he vanished. But the photograph remained the impossible, dreadful photograph of the Garrett family, standing rigidly on their porch while beneath their feet a hand reached through the floorboards. A hand the family refused to acknowledge, even as fear warped their faces. Laura had to know. Was Michael alive when that picture was taken? Had he been trapped under the porch, injured, dying, while his family posed above him? Or was the hand reaching from a corpse hidden in the crawl space? The only way to find out was to find the old farm. With help from county preservation maps and GPS data, Laura located the Garrett property. The farmhouse still stood abandoned, weathered, and alone on 5 acres. She'd secured permission to conduct a survey, though she'd omitted the real reason. The porch was still there, grey, decaying, but unmistakably the same one from the 1885 photograph. Laura stepped toward it with her equipment flashlight, pry-bar gloves, camera, and knelt to shine her light into the darkness beneath the porch floorboards. The ground beneath her palms was nothing but cold, bare earth, dark, damp, and smelling of age. From where she crouched, Laura could see the underside of the porch floorboards, the old joists holding them up and beyond. That, the stone foundation of the house. She moved slowly, her flashlight cutting through the shadows as she crawled deeper. The crawl space was larger than she expected, about 5 feet high near the foundation, shrinking to 3 feet toward the porch's outer edge. Someone could have hidden down here. Someone could have moved. Then her flashlight hit something. A shape. One that did not belong. She froze, breath catching. As she inched closer, her heart pounded so loudly she could hear it in her ears. Half buried in the dirt about 6 feet from where the family would have stood for their photograph lay a human skeleton. It was curled on its side, one arm stretched upward toward the floorboards, its hand positioned exactly where Laura had seen it in the old photo fingers, reaching through the gap between the boards. The skeleton had been disturbed over time by soil shifts, by animals, but enough remained to tell the truth. Laura sank back onto her heels as tears blurred her vision. She had found Michael Garrett. He had been here for 139 years, trapped beneath his family's porch, his hand frozen in one last, desperate gesture. Laura called the police. Within 2 hours, the Wayne County medical examiner arrived, along with the sheriff and a forensic anthropology team from the University of Rochester. They worked carefully, documenting every inch of the scene, excavating the remains with meticulous precision, preserving anything that might reveal what happened in August of 1885. Laura stood outside, answering their questions. She showed them the photograph, the sliver of a hand visible through the floorboards, the family history, the father Joseph Garrett's embezzlement conviction. Sheriff Karen Michaels studied the image for a long moment. "So you think the father killed him and put him under the porch?" she asked. "I think Michael found out about the fraud," Laura replied. "He must have threatened to expose it." They fought. Michael was hurt, maybe badly. And 2 days later, that photo was taken. That hand, her voice broke. He was reaching up while his family stood above him. Whether he was still alive or already dying, I don't know. But they knew. You can see it in their faces. That evening, forensic anthropologist Dr. James Chen completed a preliminary examination. He laid the bones out on a tarp and motioned them over. A male around 16 to 18 years old, consistent with Michael Garrett. He said gently, "Cause of death, severe trauma to the skull." He pointed to a long fracture across the back of the skull, likely struck with a heavy object, something like a hammer or iron bar. It would have been fatal, though not necessarily immediately. Laura felt the ground sway beneath her. How long would he have survived? It's impossible to know, Dr. Chen answered, but his position tells us something important. His arm is extended upward. His hand is reaching. You don't place a dead body like this. This indicates he was alive when he was put here, possibly conscious. He was trying to signal for help. Sheriff Michaels scribbled notes. So the father struck him, hid him under the porch while he was still alive, and left him to die. That is consistent with the evidence Dr. Chen confirmed. And there's more. Look at the finger bones. He held up the delicate phalanges. These scratches are from scraping the wood. Repeatedly. He was trying to push through the gap to make noise to be noticed. The camera captured one of those moments. Laura stared again at the 1885 photograph at the Stiff family, above pretending normalcy, while below them, Michael died in darkness, scraping, reaching, hoping. How long would he have lived? She whispered. Dr. Chen sighed. With this fracture hours, maybe a day or two. He would have drifted in and out of consciousness in severe pain, unable to escape. The space was too tight, and in his condition he could never have broken the boards. News spread fast. 139-year-old murder revealed by photograph. Cameras flooded Palmyra. Historians, journalists, and true crime fans filled Laura's inbox. But she cared only about one question. What had his siblings known? Robert, Elizabeth, Caroline? Sarah, they had all stood there for the photograph. They had known he was beneath them. What had they been told? What had they believed? Had any of them ever tried to speak? The answer arrived unexpectedly. Jennifer Martinez. Sarah Garrett's great-granddaughter contacted Laura. They met in a Rochester coffee shop. Jennifer, a nervous woman with warm eyes, placed a small wooden box on the table. "My grandmother gave this to me," she said. Sarah's granddaughter. "Before she died, she told me Sarah had confessed something. Something the family hid for nearly 80 years. She opened the box. Inside was a fragile bundle of yellowed pages tied with a faded ribbon. Sarah wrote this in 1942. She believed she was dying. She wanted to confess before facing God. Laura's hands shook as she unfolded the first page. Her handwriting trembled, but each word remained painfully clear. "My name is Sarah Garrett Martinez, and I must confess to knowledge of a terrible crime." Sarah wrote that in 1942, when she was 65, believing she might die soon. She could not keep the truth with her any longer. In careful, halting sentences, she described August of 1885, when she was 8 years old. Her father had murdered her brother Michael and forced the rest of the family to help hide what he had done. For 77 years, she carried that burden in silence. At last, She set it down on paper. The confession ran 10 pages, every line a small, aching detail. Sarah remembered the fight, heard it from her bed, the way children do, half awake and terrified. She heard her father and Michael argue. She heard the terrible, sudden sound of a cry that ended too quickly. Later in the dark, she saw Joseph drag Michael's limp body onto the porch. Father told us Michael attacked him, Sarah wrote. He said he defended himself. He said Michael was still breathing, but badly hurt. If we called a doctor or the sheriff, they would arrest Father and our family would be ruined. Joseph said Michael had threatened to ruin them with accusations about the bank, that Michael had become dangerous, unstable. He made Mary and Robert help him slide Michael beneath the porch, insisting they leave him there until he came to his senses. Sarah described the days after in a voice that trembled on the page. Under the boards, Michael regained consciousness, weak and calling out for help. He begged for water for someone to look for mercy. Joseph forbade any of them from offering aid. He said Michael was hysterical, Sarah wrote. We were to ignore him until he calmed down. She remembered hearing her brother call for their mother, a small pleading voice, swallowed by the joists. Laura read those lines again and again, each one tightening a cold knot in her chest. She had come to Palmyra, armed with maps and permissions, a high-resolution print of the 1885 photograph folded on the passenger seat beside her. The Wayne County Historical Preservation Office had helped her match the 1885 property maps to modern GPS. The Garrett farmhouse still stood stubborn and lonely on 5 acres. The great 240-acre farm had been parceled away. Long ago, its fields changed to other uses. But the white clapboard house, its gingerbread trim, faded its porch. Sagging matched the photograph perfectly. The current owner, a development firm in Rochester, had never built the promised subdivision. The house had been empty for years. Laura parked at the overgrown drive, stepped out into the cold air, and walked up the cracked path to stand before the porch she had only ever seen in sepia. The posts were the same. The railing matched. This was the place. She brought with her a strong LED flashlight, a pry bar, heavy gloves, and a camera. She'd told the owners she was doing a historical survey. She had not told them why. The porch rose 3 feet above the ground. The lattice that once hid the crawl space had long ago rotted away. Laura knelt, shone her light into the black cavity beneath the floorboards, and crawled in. The smell was of earth and old rot. The crawl space was bigger than she'd imagined, 5 feet high at the foundation, narrowing to roughly 3 feet near the porch's edge. A place where a person might crouch and move, or where a body might be hidden and never seen again. Her beam swept across soil and joists until it struck a shape that did not belong. She moved closer breath, shallow heart knocking. Partially buried in the dirt, about 6 feet from where the family had stood for the photograph, was a human skeleton. It lay on its side, curled one arm, thrown up toward the floorboards. The hand ended exactly where she had seen fingers reach through the gap in the old photograph. The bones were not whole. Time and animals had scattered and gnawed at them. Yet enough remained to name what they were. Laura felt something like grief and relief braided together. She had found Michael Garrett. He had been here in that dark crawl space for 139 years, his arm arrested in a final reaching gesture. She called the sheriff. Within 2 hours, the Wayne County medical examiner and a team from the University of Rochester arrived. They worked with the slow, careful patience of people who know how fragile the past is. They documented everything, photographed, measured, catalogued. Then began the delicate business of excavation. Laura watched from the yard hands, numb, and walked the officers through how she had located the house, how the photograph had led her here. She showed them the image, the thin, impossible hand between porch boards, and told them about Joseph Garrett's later conviction for embezzlement. Sheriff Karen Michaels, a woman in her 40s, with a steady gaze, studied the photograph, then the bones. "So you think the father killed him and hid him under the porch?" she asked. Laura answered as best she could. "I think Michael saw what his father was doing at the bank. He threatened to tell. They fought. He was injured badly." 2 days later, the family posed for the photograph. That hand was reaching up while they stood above him. Whether he was alive when the shutter clicked, I don't know. But they knew he was there. You see it in their faces. That evening, Dr. James Chen, a forensic anthropologist with careful hands and a soft voice, spread the bones on a tarp and called Laura and Sheriff Michaels near. "Male about 16 to 18, he said, reading the remains the way a reader reads a text. Consistent with Michael Garrett. He traced a line along the skull with a gloved finger. Cause of death? Severe cranial trauma. See this fracture across the occipital? Likely struck with a heavy instrument hammer iron bar? Something blunt and forceful. Fatal, though not necessarily instantly. How long he lived afterward is hard to say." Laura swallowed. "Could he have survived long enough to be conscious when he was placed under the porch?" Dr. Chen looked at the arm bones. "Yes. The way the arm is extended and the hand is positioned suggests it was an active reach. A dead body doesn't reach. There are also scrape marks on the phalanges, microscopic scoring, where the bone rubbed against wood. He tried to force himself through that gap. He scratched at the boards. He called out. The photograph someone captured, one of those desperate attempts. The truth folded over her like nightfall. The family posed for the camera, stiff smiles and white knuckles, while beneath them a boy slipped away. "How long would he have lasted?" she whispered. Dr. Chen's voice was gentle and terrible. "With that skull fracture, hours, perhaps a day. He would have drifted in and out of consciousness in extreme pain, unable to free himself. The crawl space is confining. He simply could not have pushed his way out, not with that injury." News of the discovery leapt across the country. Headlines blared, 139-year-old murder solved by a photograph. Reporters and historians pressed for answers. The public devoured the story. Betrayal, financial fraud, a photograph that kept a dying boy's final plea. But Laura wanted something quieter to know what the family, those who stood over him, had believed, and what they had been made to do. An unexpected messenger arrived in the form of Jennifer Martinez, a school teacher and the great-granddaughter of Sarah Garrett. They met in a small coffee shop in Rochester. Jennifer set a worn wooden box between them, and with hands that trembled like leaves, opened it. "My grandmother gave this to me," she said. She said Sarah made her promise to keep it safe until she was ready. She told me Sarah wanted the truth known before she died. Inside the box lay a packet of brittle papers tied with a faded ribbon. Sarah's confession began again at Laura's fingertips. The pages smelled like dust and the passage of years. Laura unfolded the first sheet, each line heavy with the weight of a lifetime of secrecy, finally unloosed. The blow would have been fatal, though not necessarily instant. Laura felt a wave of nausea. How long could he have survived? It was impossible to say precisely, but the positioning of the remains told its own story. Michael's arm was extended upward, hand reaching toward the floorboards. A corpse doesn't reach. This suggested he had been alive when placed under the porch, conscious, trying desperately to signal for help. Sheriff Michaels scribbled notes as Dr. Chen explained. The father could have struck him during the fight, the neighbor overheard, then hidden him under the porch while he was still alive, though dying. That fits the evidence. Dr. Chen pointed to the bones of the hand. See these scratches on the fingers. He scraped against the wood repeatedly, trying to push through the gap, trying to be seen to be heard. The photograph captured one of those moments. Laura looked again at the 1885 image. Above, the family stood stiffly for the camera, pretending all was normal. Below, Michael struggled in darkness, his hand pushing desperately through the only space he could reach, hoping someone would notice, hoping someone would save him. How long would he have lasted under there? Laura asked quietly. Dr. Chen's face tightened. With a skull fracture like this, hours, at most possibly a day or two. He would have drifted in and out of consciousness in terrible pain, completely unable to escape. The crawl space is too tight. He had no strength to break through the boards. The story exploded across the country. 139-year-old murder solved by photograph ran in bold headlines. Family betrayal, financial fraud, and a silent plea preserved in a century-old photograph captivated historians, journalists, and true crime enthusiasts alike. But Laura's mind was on a quieter, deeper question. What had the family known? Michael's siblings, Robert, Elizabeth, Caroline, and Sarah, had been present when the photo was taken. They stood above their dying brother. What did they understand? Had any of them ever tried to speak the truth? The answer came from an unexpected source. Jennifer Martinez, Sarah Garrett's great-granddaughter, reached out through the Historical Society. A high school teacher in her early 40s, Jennifer arrived at a coffee shop in Rochester carrying a small wooden box. "My grandmother gave this to me before she died," Jennifer said. She said Sarah needed to tell someone the truth she couldn't share when she was alive. Inside the box lay yellowed, fragile papers tied with a faded ribbon. Sarah had written them in 1942 at age 65, newly diagnosed with heart disease. She thought she was dying, though she would live another 21 years. She had believed she faced her final judgment and could not go to God without confessing the truth. Laura's hands shook as she unfolded the first page. The handwriting was shaky but legible. "My name is Sarah Garrett Martinez, and I must confess to knowledge of a terrible crime. In August 1885, when I was 8 years old, my father murdered my brother Michael and forced our family to help conceal his crime. I have carried this burden for 77 years, and I cannot die without telling the truth that no one would hear when I was a child." The confession stretched 10 pages. Sarah described the night of August 15, 1885, hearing the fight between her father and Michael, hearing Michael's scream cut short, watching her father drag Michael's unconscious body onto the porch. Her father told them Michael had attacked him, that he defended himself, and that Michael was badly hurt, but still alive. If they called a doctor or the sheriff, they would all be ruined. Michael had threatened to expose the family's crimes at the bank, Joseph said, and had become dangerous. Mother and Robert were forced to help place Michael beneath the porch until he came to his senses. Sarah described the horror of the days that followed. Michael regained consciousness, calling out, begging for help. Father told us to ignore him, she wrote. He forbade anyone from giving Michael water or checking on him. She heard her brother calling for their mother. I heard him crying, saying he couldn't see, that his head hurt terribly, that he was afraid. Mother wept but did nothing. Father convinced her that helping Michael would destroy the family, that if the truth came out, we would all starve. She chose us over him. By the third day, the day of the photographer's visit, Michael was mostly silent, only making occasional weak sounds. Joseph insisted the family portrait proceed as scheduled. To cancel would raise suspicions, he said. The children stood on the porch and Sarah could feel her brother beneath their feet. I could hear him breathing raggedly, Sarah wrote. I knew he was dying. When the photographer arranged us, I looked down and saw Michael's hand pushing through the gap between the boards. His fingers moved slightly, still reaching. I wanted to scream to grab the photographer to tell him, but Father's eyes were on me, and I was 8 years old and terrified. So I stayed silent. The photograph was taken. The hand was visible, partly hidden in shadow. When the finished portrait arrived 2 weeks later, Joseph saw it and ordered it destroyed, but it was too late. The photographer had made multiple prints, and one had survived passing through estate sales and family dispersals until it landed in Laura's hands 139 years later. Michael had died late on the evening of August 17th, 1885, likely just hours after the photograph was taken. That night, Joseph Garrett had buried him deeper beneath the porch, covering the grave with lime and stones. The official story claimed Michael had run away. When Joseph's embezzlement was uncovered 3 months later, the family's shame became total. They lost everything, their fortune, their reputation, their standing in the community. But Michael's siblings had lost something far more valuable long before that. Sarah wrote, "We lost our souls when we let Michael die beneath our feet. I have never forgiven myself. I have never forgiven my mother, my father, or my older brother for what we did." Elizabeth and Caroline were too young to understand, but Robert and I knew. We knew and we said nothing. Her confession ended with a plea. If anyone ever finds Michael's remains, give him a proper burial. Say his name. Let the world know he was brave and good, that he tried to do the right thing, and that his family failed him in the most terrible way. His name was Michael Robert Garrett. He was 16. He deserved so much better than we gave him. Laura sat in the coffee shop, tears streaming, reading Sarah's words again and again. Jennifer Martinez. Sarah's great-granddaughter sat across from her, trembling a hand over her mouth. Jennifer explained, "My grandmother told me Sarah tried to go to the police in 1920 after Joseph and Mary had died. She wanted them to search under the porch, but by then, the farm had been sold. She was an elderly woman with no proof, claiming her father had committed murder 40 years earlier. They didn't believe her. They thought she was delusional. 6 weeks after the discovery, Michael Garrett's remains were finally given a proper burial in Palmyra Cemetery. The Historical Society organized the service, attended by over 300 people. Historians, activists, descendants of neighboring families, and anyone who believed Michael deserved to be remembered. Laura arranged for a headstone inscribed with Sarah's words, "Michael Robert Garrett, 1869-1885. He tried to do the right thing. We remember him. The 1885 photograph was donated to the National Museum of American History. It became part of an exhibition on hidden histories and the power of photographs to preserve truths their subjects had tried to hide. The display told the full story: Joseph Garrett's embezzlement, the murder, Sarah's confession, and the forensic evidence confirming how Michael had died. At the exhibition's opening, Laura gazed one last time at the photograph. That hand reaching up from the darkness was no longer just a disturbing detail. It was Michael's testimony, his refusal to disappear. His silent witness, finally heard after 139 years. The family had tried to erase him. Joseph Garrett had buried him in darkness, and Mary and Robert had allowed it. For decades, the truth lay hidden beneath silence and shame. But Michael's hand, frozen in that desperate reach toward light and life, had preserved the evidence. "You were seen," Laura whispered to the photograph. "Your family tried to make you disappear, but you were seen. Now everyone knows your name." Across the centuries, the hand seemed to reach toward her, not in desperation anymore, but in quiet gratitude that someone had finally understood, finally brought the truth into the light.